Emotional mastery, the skill no one teaches. Most people try to control their lives. Very few learn to control their inner reactions. Emotional mastery is not about feeling less. It is about not being ruled by what you feel. Because the real advantage in life is not intelligence. It is emotional authority. Consider the moments that cost you the most. Not the failures of planning, not the gaps in knowledge, not the lack of resources. The moments where something was said to you and you replied before you thought. Where a decision was made in a state of frustration that you spent the next week managing. Where anxiety kept you from something that mattered. Where a relationship frayed because a feeling moved into action before wisdom could intervene. Now consider the people you admire most for their effectiveness, not just their intelligence or their skill, but the quality of their presence under pressure. The person who remains composed when others unravel, who speaks clearly when the room is charged with emotion, who listens when the social pressure demands reaction, who makes the decision that needs to be made rather than the decision that feels most urgently necessary in the moment. What they have is not an absence of feeling. They feel things. They are not cold or closed or emotionally emptied. What they have is a specific relationship with their emotional experience, a relationship in which the feeling informs them rather than governs them, in which the emotion is present and acknowledged but does not determine behavior automatically. That relationship is learnable. It is a skill, one that happens to be almost entirely absent from formal education. From most professional development, from the majority of the advice given about how to improve performance, relationships, and quality of life. This audiobook teaches it. Not through abstract philosophy, not through feel-good narratives, through the precise mechanics of how emotional experience works, how it forms, how it escalates, how it drives behavior below the level of conscious choice, and through the specific, learnable capacities that build the gap between feeling and action, where genuine authority over yourself is located. 10 chapters, 5 parts, 1 fundamental transformation. From being run by your emotions to running alongside them. Begin. Part I. Why emotions control most people. Before any skill can be built, the terrain must be understood. And the terrain of emotional experience is one that most people navigate without ever having examined its underlying structure. Part 1 establishes that structure. It explains why emotions are not the secondary, irrational layer of experience that most people treat them as, not the noise beneath the signal of rational thought. They are primary. They precede the rational layer. They shape what the rational layer produces. And without understanding how that works, the project of managing your emotional experience cannot be undertaken honestly. The 2 chapters in this section do not offer practice. They offer clarity, the clarity that is the precondition for every practice that follows. Chapter 1. The invisible force behind your decisions. Most decisions feel logical, but they begin emotionally. This is not a comfortable claim. It implies something about the nature of human rationality that most people would prefer not to examine. The belief that our reasoning is primarily what drives our choices is fundamental to how most people understand themselves as thoughtful agents who weigh options and reach conclusions. not as creatures driven by feeling who construct explanations after the fact. The evidence, however, is consistent and difficult to dismiss. The human mind does not process situations in the sequence most people believe. Emotion does not arrive after reasoning and then get weighed against it. It arrives first, before the deliberate reasoning process has been initiated. The emotional system has already begun its assessment of the situation and has already produced a preliminary signal toward or away, safe or threatening, relevant or irrelevant, that will significantly shape what the reasoning process notices, considers, and concludes. This sequencing is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a feature. The emotional processing system is faster because speed was often servable relevant. The fast, rough assessment produced by the emotional system, is this a threat? Does this person like me? Provides a working hypothesis that the slower, deliberate system can then confirm, modify, or override. In most situations, this division of labor functions reasonably well. The problem is that most people are unaware the division of labor is occurring. They experience the conclusion produced by this joint process and attribute it entirely to the deliberate reasoning part. The emotional input, which may have been the primary driver, is invisible to them. They believe they made a rational decision when they actually made an emotionally initiated one that their reasoning then validated. The illusion of rational decision-making deserves careful examination because it is among the most consequential illusions that most people carry. When the emotional system produces a strong signal, a strong attraction to someone, a strong aversion to a choice, a strong sense of urgency about a situation, the deliberate reasoning system does not always evaluate that signal neutrally. It often does something different. It searches for reasons to justify what the emotional system has already decided. This process is called motivated reasoning, and it is far more common than most people realize in their own thinking. The person who is angry at a colleague will find, if they look, that the evidence against the colleague is more visible and more compelling than the evidence in the colleague's favor, not because the evidence is genuinely one-sided, but because the anger has oriented attention toward confirming what the emotional system has already concluded. The person who is attracted to an investment opportunity will find that the risks seem smaller and the potential seems larger than a dispassionate analysis would suggest, not because the opportunity is genuinely different from what it is, but because the excitement has oriented reasoning toward confirmation. The reasoning is happening. The conclusions feel justified. The emotional driver is invisible. Emotional patterns shape life in ways that are even more fundamental than individual decisions. Over time, the emotional responses that an individual characteristically produces to particular types of situations become self-reinforcing patterns, habitual ways of perceiving and responding that feel like facts about the world rather than habits of the self. The person who characteristically responds to uncertainty with anxiety will, over time, inhabit a world that genuinely seems more uncertain than the world of the person who responds to similar circumstances with curiosity or equanimity. Not because their circumstances are different, but because anxiety directs attention toward threat-confirming information and away from stability-confirming information. And this systematic attentional bias shapes what is noticed, remembered, and used to construct the ongoing narrative of lived experience. Similarly, the person who characteristically responds to criticism with defensiveness will, over time, find themselves in relationships and professional environments shaped by that defensiveness, not because others are unusually critical, but because defensive responses tend to produce certain kinds of relational dynamics and to close off certain kinds of feedback that would have been useful. The emotional pattern has shaped the environment. This is the deepest sense in which emotions control most people's lives, not through the occasional outburst or the bad day, but through the invisible, consistent shaping of attention, interpretation, and relational environment that happens when emotional patterns run without examination or intervention. You do not need to be dramatically emotional for your emotional patterns to be significantly determining your outcomes. The quiet pattern of avoiding difficult conversations because they produce discomfort has, over years, shaped your relationships and your professional trajectory in ways that are real and significant, whether or not any single avoidance was dramatic enough to notice at the time. Seeing the pattern is the beginning of everything. You cannot modify what you cannot see, and seeing it requires the kind of honest, non-defensive attention to your own emotional life that most people find uncomfortable precisely because what it reveals is significant. The first practice of this audiobook is therefore not a regulation technique or a behavioral strategy. It is a perceptual one. Begin to notice the emotional signal that precedes your decisions. Not after the decision. Retrospective awareness is useful but limited. In the moment before committing. What is the feeling that is shaping this choice? Is the reasoning you are doing primarily evaluative, genuinely weighing the options, or is it primarily confirmatory? Assembling reasons in favor of something the emotional system has already preferred. This noticing does not require perfect accuracy. The emotional driver is often genuinely difficult to identify, particularly when the emotional and rational signals are aligned. What it requires is the honest acknowledgement that the emotional layer is always present and is always doing something in the decision, and that its contribution, unexamined, tends to be larger than the contribution of conscious reasoning. That acknowledgement is the first movement toward authority. Chapter 2. Emotional reactivity versus emotional mastery. Reaction is automatic. Mastery is trained. The difference between these two modes is not the absence or presence of emotion. Both the reactive person and the masterful person feel. Both experience anger, anxiety, frustration, excitement, fear, and the full range of human emotional states. The difference is not in what is felt, but in what happens between the feeling and the behavior. In reactivity, the sequence is direct. Stimulus triggers emotion, emotion triggers behavior. The speed of this sequence varies. Sometimes it happens in a fraction of a second. Sometimes the escalation builds over minutes or hours, but the structure is the same. The feeling and the action are functionally fused. What is felt is what is done. In emotional mastery, there is an intervening step. Stimulus triggers emotion. That part of the sequence is the same. Because the emotional system is automatic and cannot be simply switched off. But between the emotion and the behavior there is a moment. A space, a place where something other than the automatic sequence happens. That space is not created by not feeling. It is created by the trained capacity to feel without immediately expressing or acting on the feeling. It is built through practice, through the accumulated experience of having stayed in the feeling without following it automatically. through the development of internal structures that can hold the emotional experience without needing to discharge it immediately. The emotional reaction loop is the mechanism through which reactivity operates, and understanding its structure is the first step toward interrupting it. The loop begins with a trigger, an event, a statement, a perception, an internal thought or memory. The trigger is received by the emotional processing system, which generates an emotional response. The emotional response activates a behavioral impulse, the urge to say something, do something, move toward or away from something. If the behavioral impulse is executed immediately, it produces consequences that then become triggers for the next cycle. If the behavioral impulse is executed with force or intensity, it typically produces responses from others that are themselves emotionally triggering, which feeds the next loop with more intensity than the first one contained. This is how conflicts escalate, how regrettable decisions accumulate into patterns, how the reactive loop, run repeatedly over years, shapes a life in directions that the person inside it did not consciously choose. The loop itself is not the problem. Emotional response to triggers is normal and appropriate. What makes the loop costly is the absence of the intervening step, the moment between impulse and action in which deliberate choice could occur but doesn't, because the capacity for that moment has not been built. Why do some people stay calm under pressure? This is one of the questions that motivates most people who seek to develop emotional mastery. Because the answer is not immediately obvious, it does not seem to be temperament. Entirely, some people who appear naturally calm are, on examination, operating from a well-developed set of internal practices rather than from an innate disposition. It does not seem to be indifference. The calm person often cares deeply about what is happening, and it does not seem to be the simple result of being in easier circumstances. The answer lies in several interacting capacities that calmly functioning people have developed, deliberately or through experience, that most people have not. The first is a different relationship with their own arousal. The person who remains calm under pressure has typically developed the ability to tolerate elevated physiological and emotional activation without treating it as an emergency that requires immediate response. They can be activated, heart rate elevated, adrenaline present, genuine emotional content flowing, and remain functional within that activation, because they have learned through experience that the activation is survivable and that the quality of their response matters more than its speed. The second capacity is more precise emotional reading, the ability to identify what they are actually feeling at a level of specificity that allows them to work with the feeling rather than simply being moved by it. The person who knows they are experiencing anxiety rather than anger, or disappointment rather than resentment, has a different relationship with what is happening internally than the person who simply experiences a global sense of bad feeling that demands expression. The specificity of the reading creates the beginning of the space needed for deliberate response. The third capacity is what might be called an outcome orientation that is broader than the immediate moment. The person who remains calm in conflict is typically holding a perspective on what they are trying to accomplish that extends beyond the next 30 seconds. They have a reason to manage their response that outweighs the appeal of expressing what the emotion is pushing for. This reason is not merely theoretical, it is actively present in the moment, counterbalancing the pull of the reactive impulse. The hidden skill of emotional delay is the capacity that most directly bridges reactivity and mastery. It is not the elimination of emotional response. It is the practiced ability to create time between the emotional response and the behavioral expression to stay in the feeling without immediately moving from it. This skill sounds simple and is, in practice, one of the more difficult things a person can develop precisely because everything in the reactive moment is pushing in the opposite direction. The urgency of the emotion, the social pressure toward immediate response, the physical discomfort of containing activation without expressing it, all of these press toward action. The delay requires something that moves against this pressure without fighting it directly. What makes it possible is not greater willpower. It is the building of specific internal structures, the breathing practices, the naming habits, the perspective access capacity that provide an alternative to the behavioral expression of the emotion without requiring the emotion to be suppressed or denied. These structures are the content of this audiobook's practical chapters. They are built one practice at a time. The building begins in Part 2. Part Sight. Understanding your emotional system. Before you can regulate your emotional experience, you need to understand how it works. Not in the abstract sense of knowing that emotions exist and have causes, but in the operational sense of knowing how your specific emotional system functions, how it builds, what intensifies it, what it responds to, and what tends to happen when it reaches its limits. Part 2 provides that operational understanding. Chapter 3 examines the architecture of emotional overwhelm, how feelings that seem to explode suddenly have, in most cases, been building quietly for a long time before the explosion. Chapter 4 builds the most foundational skill of emotional mastery, the ability to see your own emotional experience clearly before it has already taken over. Awareness precedes regulation. You cannot change the channel you cannot see. Chapter 3. Why emotions become overwhelming. Emotions don't explode randomly. They build silently. The person who loses composure in a meeting, who says something sharp, who shuts down, who escalates a conversation that could have been contained, typically did not enter the room in a state of peak activation. Something in the meeting triggered a response that was disproportionate to what the specific trigger warranted. Because the specific trigger did not activate only its own emotional weight, it activated the accumulated weight of everything that had been building beneath it. Emotional accumulation is one of the most important and least understood dynamics of human emotional experience. The emotional system maintains something like a running balance, the aggregate of activations that have been experienced but not fully processed or discharged. Each unaddressed frustration, each conversation ended with tension unresolved, each day's anxiety that was pushed through rather than acknowledged, each small disappointment that was minimized rather than felt, all of these contribute to a background load that the emotional system is carrying while it continues to process new experiences. The system has a threshold. Below the threshold, it functions normally. Above the threshold, when the accumulated load has grown large enough, or when a new activation arrives with enough intensity, the capacity for regulation becomes significantly impaired. The person at the threshold is not reacting to the immediate trigger with the measured response the trigger merits. They are reacting with the full force of everything that has been accumulating. This is why the response is often disproportionate. It is not disproportionate to the total emotional load. It is disproportionate to the visible trigger. The nervous system under pressure behaves in ways that make emotional regulation more difficult at precisely the moments when it is most needed. Under low to moderate stress, the system maintains a baseline that allows for flexible response. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with deliberate thinking, consequence evaluation, and the kind of managed response that emotional mastery requires, is sufficiently restored to do its work. The emotional signals being received or processed in parallel with deliberate reasoning. Behavior is the product of both. Under high stress, the system shifts. Resources are redirected from the deliberate processing regions to the regions responsible for fast threat response. The prefrontal cortex becomes relatively less active. The emotional processing becomes more dominant. The result is that at the moments of highest activation, when the emotional system most needs the steadying influence of deliberate thought, that steadying influence is least available. This is not a personal failing, it is a system design. And understanding it as a system design rather than a character flaw changes how you approach the moments of overwhelm, not with self-criticism for having failed to remain composed, but with recognition that the conditions at the point of overwhelm made composure genuinely more difficult, and that the intervention needed to occur earlier in the accumulation process, before the threshold was reached. Suppression backfires. This is one of the more counterintuitive and better supported findings in the psychology of emotional regulation. The intuition that suppressing an emotion, actively holding it down, refusing to acknowledge or express it, is a form of emotional control is understandable. The emotion is not being expressed. The behavior is not being driven by the feeling. From the outside, the person looks composed. What is happening on the inside is different, and its consequences are real. Active suppression of an emotional state requires cognitive resources. It requires maintaining ongoing active effort to keep the emotional content from surfacing, which consumes part of the processing capacity that would otherwise be available for the work, the conversation, or the assessment happening in the foreground. The person who is suppressing is more cognitively taxed than they appear, and the tax is cumulative. Sustained suppression across a day, a week, or longer depletes the regulatory resources that are needed for the moments when genuine regulation is required. More significantly, suppression does not reduce the emotional content. It postpones it. The feeling that is actively held down does not diminish through the holding down. It waits, and when the suppression eventually fails through exhaustion, through the accumulation of additional activations, through a trigger that exceeds the system's holding capacity, the suppressed content is released in addition to whatever the immediate trigger produced. The person who has been suppressing frustration for weeks does not experience, when they eventually break, only the frustration of the immediate moment. They experience that frustration plus everything that was being held. Suppression is not regulation, it is delay with accumulation, and it tends to produce the kind of explosive release that most people are trying to avoid through the suppression in the first place. The alternative to suppression is not expression without filter, the release of every feeling as it arises, toward whoever is present in whatever form it arrives. The alternative is the genuine processing and regulation that does not require active holding down because the emotional energy is being worked with rather than contained. What that processing looks like begins with the skill in the next chapter. Chapter 4. The skill of emotional awareness. You cannot regulate what you cannot notice. This single sentence contains the foundational logic of emotional mastery, and most people violate it continuously without realizing they are doing so. They attempt to manage emotional responses that they have not yet clearly identified, to regulate states they have not named, to work with feelings they cannot yet distinguish from one another. The attempt to regulate without awareness produces, at best, a rough approximation of what the situation actually requires. Emotional awareness is not introspection in the vague sense of thinking about your feelings. It is a specific, trainable perceptual skill, the ability to recognize an emotional state as it is forming, before it has fully developed into the expression or the behavior it would otherwise produce. Early recognition is what creates the time and space needed for deliberate response rather than automatic reaction. The difference between early and late recognition of an emotional state is significant. Recognizing frustration when it first begins to stir when it is a faint, barely formed sense of friction leaves you with access to the full range of regulated responses. Recognizing it for the first time when it has already become acute irritation, when it has already begun to color your perception and narrow your cognitive range, leaves you with significantly less capacity to manage its expression. The skill of recognizing emotions early is developed by practicing attention to the earliest signals an emotion produces, not the full-blown feeling, but its precursors, the slight tension in the jaw or shoulders that tends to precede frustration, the mild heaviness in the chest that tends to precede sadness, the accelerated quality of thought that tends to precede anxiety, the specific quality of tension harrowing that tends to precede anger. These early signals are present for most people but are typically below the threshold of habitual attention. They go unnoticed because awareness has not been trained to look for them at that level of subtlety. Naming emotions without judgment is the second component of emotional awareness, and it requires care because the word judgment covers a range of responses that are worth distinguishing. Naming an emotion without judgment does not mean naming it without accuracy. It means naming it without the secondary layer of evaluation, the made emotion, the feeling about the feeling that most people attach automatically to emotional states they consider problematic or inappropriate. The anger that is recognized as anger is one level of experience. The anger that is recognized as anger and then immediately judged as evidence of personal failure, or as something that must be denied, or as a shameful loss of self-control, that is two levels of experience, and the second level significantly complicates the management of the first. When you name an emotion with judgment, you are simultaneously dealing with the emotion and with your relationship to having it. That double burden is considerable, particularly under stress. The person who allows themselves to recognize anger as simply anger, not as a problem to be solved or a weakness to be hidden, but as a piece of information about their current state, is in a significantly better position to manage what happens next than the person who is managing both the anger and the shame about the anger. The practice of naming has a specific neurological basis that is worth understanding because it makes the practice more credible and more deliberate. When an emotional state is active, the regions of the brain responsible for emotional processing are relatively dominant. When that emotional state is named, specifically labeled in language, the regions responsible for deliberate language processing become engaged. This engagement does not eliminate the emotional activation, but it changes the brain's functional organization in that moment in ways that are measurable. The labeling of an emotional state tends to slightly reduce the intensity of the physiological activation associated with it, and slightly increases the access to the deliberate processing that the prefrontal cortex supports. The name creates a small but real shift. The emotion moves, partly, from something you are inside to something you are observing. That movement from merger to observation is the beginning of the space in which regulation becomes possible. The power of emotional clarity is what becomes available when early recognition and non-judgmental naming are combined into a consistent practice. Emotional clarity means knowing, with reasonable precision, what you are feeling and why, not as a theoretical reconstruction after the fact, but as a live awareness in the moment of experiencing. It means being able to distinguish between the frustration that is primarily about this specific situation and the frustration that is being amplified by accumulated load from the rest of the week. It means being able to distinguish between anxiety that is an accurate response to genuine risk and anxiety that is a habitual co-response to uncertainty. It means knowing when anger is a signal that something important is being violated and when it is a cover for vulnerability that is more difficult to acknowledge. These distinctions matter enormously for what the appropriate response is. The person who cannot make them treats all frustration, all anxiety, all anger as equivalent, and responds to each instance with the same undifferentiated response, which is rarely calibrated to what any specific instance actually requires. The person who can make these distinctions has a more precise instrument available. They can respond to this frustration with what this frustration warrants, rather than with the aggregate weight of everything labeled frustration that their system has ever associated with the feeling. Building emotional clarity requires a specific daily practice that is simpler in description than in consistent execution. Once each day, not during a crisis, not during high activation, but in an ordinary moment of reflection, pause and ask what you have been feeling across the day. Not what happened, what you felt in response to what happened. And then name it specifically with as much precision as the vocabulary of emotion allows. This practice, maintained consistently over weeks and months, does several things. It develops the vocabulary of emotional experience, the range of specific words and concepts available to name what is happening internally, which directly improves the precision of the awareness. It builds the habit of turning attention toward emotional content rather than away from it, which makes early recognition more natural, and it reveals patterns, the emotions that recur, the triggers that consistently produce specific responses, the times and contexts associated with elevated vulnerability that are genuinely useful information for managing the emotional system more skillfully. You cannot regulate what you cannot notice. Begin to notice. Part say. The core skills of emotional mastery. Understanding the emotional system, how it works, how it builds, how it is influenced by accumulated load and physiological state is necessary but not sufficient. At some point, understanding must give way to practice. The concepts must become capacities. Part 3 builds the 3 foundational capacities of emotional mastery: the pause that creates the space between emotion and action, the regulation strategies that work with the emotional system rather than against it, and the boundaries that protect the emotional system from unnecessary external demands. Each of these capacities is learnable. Each requires practice, and each, built and maintained, changes the quality of your relationship with your own emotional life in ways that compound over time. Chapter 5. The pause between emotion and action. Your power lies inside the pause. This is not a poetic claim. It is a precise description of where genuine emotional authority is located. Not in the absence of feeling, not in the ability to be unmoved, not in the performance of composure over a turbulent interior, in the practiced capacity to create a moment between the emotional experience and the behavior it would otherwise automatically produce. That moment which is created, not found, and which must be built through training because it does not exist naturally in the reactive state, is the location of every choice that is genuinely different from the automatic one. Everything that constitutes deliberate rather than reactive living happens in the pause. The neurological case for the pause is grounded in what happens in the brain during high emotional activation. Under the conditions of strong feeling anger, fear, intense desire, strong anxiety, the fast-acting emotional processing systems are dominant and the slower deliberate systems have reduced access to the resources they need. Acting from this state produces behavior that is generated by the emotional system's priorities rather than by the deliberate system's longer horizon reasoning. The pause interrupts this dominance. Even a few seconds of genuine pause, not a performance of considering, but actual non-hesitation, while the physiological activation begins its natural return toward baseline, begins to restore the balance between the two systems. The deliberate mind regains some access. The emotional signal is still present, but it is competing with something rather than operating unchallenged. Creating space before reacting is both simpler and more demanding than most people expect. Simpler because the mechanics are not complex. You receive a stimulus. You feel the emotional response forming. You do not immediately act. That is, structurally, what the pause requires. More demanding because the entire force of the reactive moment is pushing toward action. The urgency that strong emotion creates, the sense that something must be done, said, expressed, responded to immediately, is physiologically real. It is produced by the same neurochemical cascade that drives threat response, and it carries the same compelling quality that makes threat responses feel like necessities rather than choices. The pause is not taken against mild preference. It is taken against genuine physiological pressure. This is why the pause must be trained, not understood and then deployed in the moment of strong activation from a position of zero prior practice. Trained, practiced in small moments so that the capacity exists in larger ones. Training the pause begins with exactly that, small moments. Low-stakes interactions where the automatic response is available and the practice is to delay it briefly. The message that arrives and produces the immediate impulse to respond, wait. The comment that invites an immediate opinion, consider before speaking. The frustration that arises and pushes toward expression, breathe before saying anything. These micro-pauses are not about achieving perfect responses in low-stakes situations. They are building the neural pathway that the pause will run on in high-stakes situations. The pathway must exist before the situation requires it. The situation requiring it for the first time is not the time to build it. The physiological practice that supports the pause is breath specifically. The deliberate extension of the exhalation, This works through the mechanism described in earlier chapters of this audiobook. The respiratory pattern communicates to the nervous system about the level of threat in the environment. Extended exhalation is associated with safety with the regulated state. It provides a physiological backward channel into the activation, reducing its intensity slightly and opening slightly more access to the deliberate mind. The breath practice is not a substitute for the pause. It is a tool within the pause, something to do with the space the pause creates that both maintains the pause and makes it more productive. Breathing deliberately while not responding gives the physiological activation somewhere to go that is not behavioral expression. As the pause practice develops, it begins to change the experience of strong emotional states in a specific and important way. The person who has practiced the pause consistently across many situations begins to have a different relationship with their own activation. Rather than experiencing high emotional intensity as something that must be expressed or something that is consuming them from the inside, they begin to experience it as something that is happening, that is present, that is real, that is being felt, but that they are in some important sense alongside rather than entirely inside. The observer position, described in other chapters of this audiobook series, becomes accessible. This shift is not dramatic, it is incremental, but it constitutes one of the most significant changes in the quality of lived experience that the development of emotional mastery produces. The feeling is no longer the only reality in the moment. There is something else present to the awareness of the feeling, which is already a different relationship with it than being absorbed by it. There is a specific challenge in pause training that deserves direct acknowledgement: social pressure. In many social situations, not responding immediately to an emotional provocation is interpreted by others, sometimes correctly, as a form of engagement. The pause looks from the outside like consideration, but in some social contexts it looks like avoidance, weakness, or absence of conviction. There is pressure, sometimes explicit and sometimes ambient, toward the immediate expression of your reaction as evidence that you are genuinely present and engaged. The person developing the pause must learn to distinguish between the social performance of immediate response and the actual requirement of this situation. In many situations, the pause, the brief period of genuinely considering before speaking, produces better outcomes for all parties, including the relationship, than the immediate expression would have. The outcome is better precisely because the response was chosen rather than generated automatically. The pause is not a failure of engagement. It is engagement at a higher level, engagement not just with the content of the moment, but with what the moment actually requires, which is rarely the first thing the emotional system volunteers. Chapter 6. Emotional regulation without suppression. Control does not mean denial. This is the distinction that separates the productive development of emotional mastery from the counterproductive pursuit of emotional suppression. Both look like self-control from the outside. Both produce a certain level of behavioral restraint. But their internal processes and their long-term consequences are significantly different. Suppression holds emotion down through ongoing active effort. It requires the continuous expenditure of regulatory resources to keep the emotional content from surfacing. It depletes, it accumulates the backlog described in Chapter 3, and eventually it fails, typically at the worst available moment. Genuine regulation works with the emotional energy rather than against it. It finds ways to process, channel, and work through the emotional content that do not require holding it down, that allow the feeling to be fully present while not allowing it to determine behavior automatically. It does not deplete in the same way because it is not creating an ongoing internal conflict between the feeling and the effort to contain it. It is moving the energy rather than damming it. Healthy regulation strategies are diverse, and individuals vary in which strategies are most effective for their specific temperament and emotional architecture. What the effective strategies share is a specific structural feature. They engage with the emotional content rather than denying it. Physical movement is one of the most reliable and underutilized regulatory strategies available. The emotional activation produced by the nervous system is preparation for physical response. The body is mobilized for action. When that mobilization is followed by actual physical movement, the physiological activation has somewhere to go that is appropriate to its nature. The anxiety that produces restless physical energy is partially discharged by the movement. The frustration that produces muscular tension finds release in physical exertion. This is not a metaphor. The neurochemicals and hormones of emotional activation are metabolized more efficiently when physical activity follows the activation than when the body remains still while continuing to contain the charge. Verbal processing, speaking or writing about the emotional experience, uses language to engage with emotional content in ways that activate the deliberate processing system alongside the emotional one. As described in the previous chapter, naming the emotional experience creates a shift in how the brain is organizing the moment. Extended verbal engagement, describing not just the feeling but its context, its intensity, its history, the thoughts associated with it, extends this organizing shift and often produces a sense of integration or clarity that was not present before the processing began. Releasing emotion safely is the practice of allowing emotional content to be expressed or discharged in conditions that are not harmful, that do not damage relationships, do not compromise professional standing, and do not produce consequences that then require their own management. This requires deliberate choice about context. The same emotional content that would be damaging if expressed in a professional meeting toward a person who has triggered it can be expressed safely in a private context to a trusted person. In writing that is not sent, in a physical practice that provides an appropriate outlet, the content is the same. The context determines whether the expression is regulatory or additionally costly. Most people's emotional release happens in the wrong context because it happens at the point of maximum activation, when the capacity for deliberate context selection is most impaired. The person who learns to recognize the building of activation early enough has more choice about when and where to engage with it. They can create the right context deliberately rather than defaulting to whatever context they happen to be in when the pressure exceeds the holding capacity. Stabilizing the inner state is the regulatory goal during high activation moments, when release is not immediately possible when you are in the meeting, in the conversation, in the situation, and the emotional content must be held for a finite period without either exploding or depleting through suppression. The stability practices for these moments are physiological in nature because the regulation need is physiological. Breath remains the primary tool. Slow, extended exhalation, repeated deliberately several times, changes the nervous system's arousal state in the direction of regulation. Deliberate grounding, attending to physical sensations of contact, to what is visually present, to the specific quality of the immediate environment engages the sensory processing system in ways that reduce the dominance of the internally focused emotional processing. These practices do not eliminate the emotional activation. They reduce it slightly and, more importantly, maintain access to the deliberate processing that allows the situation to be navigated rather than merely survived. They are not heroic feats of self-control. They are small, quiet, practical interventions that create just enough shift to keep the deliberate mind operational under conditions that would otherwise reduce it to irrelevance. The most important thing to understand about emotional regulation is that it becomes more available with practice, not just practice in regulation itself, but the earlier practices of emotional awareness. The person who can recognize their emotional state early enough has access to more regulatory capacity than the person who first notices the emotion when it has already reached intensity. Earlier recognition means earlier intervention. Earlier intervention means working with a less activated system. The architecture of emotional mastery is sequential. Awareness creates the possibility of pause. Pause creates the possibility of regulation. Regulation creates the possibility of genuine response rather than automatic reaction. Each layer depends on the one beneath it. Build the awareness, the rest follows. Chapter 7. Emotional boundaries. Not every emotion around you belongs to you. This is a statement that requires unpacking because it runs against the way most people naturally relate to emotional experience in social environments. When someone around you is upset, anxious, angry, or frightened, the natural response through the same mirror neuron mechanisms described in the panic chapter of this audiobook series is to begin generating a corresponding emotional state in yourself. The distress of someone close to you produces, automatically and without deliberate initiation, a degree of distress in you. The anger of someone across from you produces activation in your system. The anxiety in the room enters you. This emotional contagion in relationships is one of the primary challenges of emotional mastery in real life. It is one thing to manage your emotional state when the environment is neutral. It is another thing entirely to maintain regulated access to deliberate processing when the environment is saturated with other people's strong emotional content. The first requirement for managing this challenge is the recognition that what you are feeling in the presence of others' emotional states is not necessarily your own authentic response to the situation. It may be a borrowed response partially or substantially produced by the contagion effect rather than by your independent assessment of what is happening. The question that names the skill is the same one described in the Crisis Clarity chapter. Is what I am currently feeling the product of my own assessment of this situation? Or is it the product of being near someone who is feeling it? Protecting emotional energy is the active practice of maintaining a degree of differentiation from the emotional states of others, not by becoming indifferent to them, but by maintaining the observer position that allows you to be present to someone's emotional state without being consumed by it. The observer position in relational contexts means that you are attending to the other person's feeling with genuine care and interest. You are registering the information their emotional state contains, and you are not merging with that state, not losing the thread of your own regulated interior in the process of engaging with their activated one. This is not distance. It is not the cold withholding of connection that protects the self at the expense of relationship. It is the maintenance of enough internal ground that you can be fully present to the other person's experience from a place that can actually be helpful rather than the merger that makes you a fellow sufferer rather than a resource. The person who has merged with another's distress is not more helpful to them than the person who has maintained regulated presence. They are typically less helpful because the regulatory capacity they have absorbed from the other person's state was the specific resource needed to help. A calm presence that can hear the distress without amplifying it, that can think clearly about what the situation requires, that can respond deliberately rather than creatively. That presence is only available to the person who has not been pulled entirely into the other person's emotional field. Staying calm around intense people is a specific challenge that combines elements of everything described so far in this chapter and adds one additional element: the direct social pressure that intensely emotional people often create toward emotional synchronization. The person who is highly activated, who is angry or frightened or urgently distressed, often communicates, explicitly or implicitly, that the appropriate response to their state is a matched level of urgency or concern. The calm presence that does not match their activation can be experienced by them as indifference, as dismissiveness, as a failure to take seriously what is genuinely serious to them. This social pressure is real, and managing it requires something beyond simply maintaining internal calm. It requires communicating genuine engagement through means other than emotional activation. The calm voice that is warm rather than cold. The body language that is present and oriented rather than withdrawn. The questions and responses that demonstrate real understanding of the other person's state even while not sharing it. These signals communicate: I am here, I am engaged, I am taking this seriously, and I am not being swept up by it. That combination, presence without merger, is the expression of emotional boundaries in practice. It is also, over time, genuinely stabilizing for the intensely emotional person, because it provides them with a regulated model in their environment, which, through the same contagion mechanism that produces the activation in the first place, tends to gradually moderate their state. The calm person does not just protect themselves. They often, quietly and without announcement, help regulate the people around them. That is one of the less obvious forms of emotional influence available to the person who has done the work of building internal stability. Part of Mastering Emotions in Real Life. The skills built in Part 3 must ultimately be applied in the specific, demanding conditions of real life, not in the controlled environment of daily reflection or the low-stakes moments of practice, but in actual conflict, under actual pressure, in interactions with actual consequences. Part 4 takes the architecture into these real conditions. Chapter 8 addresses emotional stability in conflict, the specific challenge of maintaining regulated access to deliberate thinking when another person's emotional activation is directly engaging yours. Chapter 9 addresses emotional power in high-stress moments, the sustained pressure situations where the gradual depletion of regulatory resources under prolonged demand creates a specific kind of challenge distinct from single moments of acute activation. These are the chapters where the training becomes most clearly an advantage. Chapter 8. Emotional stability in conflict. The calmest person often leads the outcome. This observation about conflict is not primarily a statement about authority or power in the conventional sense. It is a statement about cognitive access. In a conflict, an argument, a negotiation, a difficult confrontation, any exchange where significant interests are in tension and emotional activation is present on both sides, the person who maintains the highest level of access to deliberate thinking is operating with a cognitive advantage over the person whose deliberate thinking has been narrowed by high emotional activation. The calm person sees more. They notice what the other person is communicating beneath what they are saying. They retain the ability to think about what the situation actually requires rather than only reacting to what the previous 30 seconds produced. They can make choices about their response that serve their genuine interests rather than the immediate relief of whatever the activation is demanding. These are real advantages, and they compound. The calm person's measured responses tend to de-escalate the exchange rather than amplify it, which reduces the activation on both sides, which improves both parties' access to the deliberate thinking that productive resolution requires. The calmness is not just an internal asset. It changes the quality of the exchange itself. Staying composed during arguments requires a specific understanding of what composure in conflict actually means, because it is frequently misunderstood as the emotional withdrawal that it is not. Composure in conflict is not silence, not agreement, not the suppression of your position or the abandonment of what matters to you. It is the maintenance of the emotional regulation that keeps you able to advocate effectively for your position, to hear the other person's position accurately, and to work toward the outcome that actually serves your interests rather than the outcome that satisfies the immediate emotional demand for victory or relief. The composed person in conflict is present and engaged. They are feeling. They are invested in the outcome. What they are not doing is allowing the feeling and the investment to overwhelm the deliberate processing that would serve them better than any reactive expression could. Discomposure is practically expressed through specific behaviors, speaking at a measured pace rather than the accelerated pace that high activation produces. Using precise language rather than the emotionally loaded language that activated states generate. Asking questions before asserting positions, which provides information and maintains the curious orientation that is incompatible with the closed, defensive posture of full reactivity, and returning consistently to the actual subject of the conflict rather than being pulled into the meta-conflict about how the conflict is being conducted. Diffusing emotional escalation is a specific skill in conflict management that goes beyond maintaining your own composure. It involves actively creating conditions that make it easier for the other person to de-escalate as well, not by accommodating their position, but by managing the interaction in ways that reduce rather than amplify the activation on both sides. The primary way conflicts escalate is through reciprocal activation. One person's emotional intensity produces an emotional response in the other, which increases the first person's activation, which further increases the second's, in the upward spiral that most unmanaged conflicts follow. Interrupting this spiral requires one person to decline to match the other's level of activation to receive an escalated response without returning an equivalently escalated one. This is the most difficult moment in conflict emotional management. The impulse to match activation is strong. It feels like appropriate response. It feels like defending yourself. And the social context of conflict sometimes creates the impression that declining to match escalation is conceding something, that staying calm is surrendering. It is not. It is redirecting. The person who responds to escalation with a calmer, more measured response than the escalation invited is not yielding their position. They are changing the structure of the exchange, reducing the emotional temperature that makes both parties' deliberate processing less available. They are creating conditions under which a productive outcome is possible that was not possible at the higher temperature. Responding instead of reacting is the phrase that captures the essential practice of emotional stability in conflict. Responding means choosing your output based on what the situation requires. Reacting means generating your output directly from the emotional state produced by what the other person just did. The distinction in outcomes over the course of an entire conflict and over the accumulated course of many conflicts across a relationship or professional life is substantial. The person who consistently responds rather than reacts is building a different relational history than the person who consistently reacts. And relational history shapes the environment in which all future interactions happen. There is one more dimension of emotional stability in conflict worth examining: the management of your own grievance. Every conflict involves, from your perspective, something that is wrong. The other person has done something unreasonable, or failed to do something required, or violated an expectation or a value. The grievance is real. It is the legitimate content of the conflict. But the emotional experience of the grievance, the full weight of how it feels to be in the position of having been wronged, dismissed, misunderstood, or unfairly treated, tends to expand in high activation states beyond the scope of the specific wrong. The specific wrong becomes evidence of everything, becomes the instance of a pattern, becomes the proof of a deeper and more alarming conclusion about the other person or the relationship. The conflict about the specific thing becomes, in the activated state, a conflict about everything. Managing the grievance means maintaining the boundary between what this specific conflict is about and everything that the activation of the conflict is connecting it to. It means staying with the specifics: what happened, what it affected, what would need to change, rather than following the activation into the wider territory that the emotional state is trying to annex. This is one of the most demanding aspects of emotional stability in conflict, and it is also one of the most productive. The conflict that stays specific is the conflict that can be resolved. Chapter 9: Emotional Power in High-Stress Moments. Pressure reveals emotional training. Not character in the popular sense, the idea that pressure shows who people really are beneath their performance. That framing implies the trained response is somehow less authentic than the reactive one. What pressure actually reveals is which systems are running the show: the well-practiced, deliberately trained systems, or the automatic reactive ones that require no training because they are default. Pressure reveals training because trained systems require cognitive resources to maintain, and pressure depletes those resources. Under low pressure, with full regulatory capacity available, many people can approximate the regulated response even without extensive practice. Under high pressure, with regulatory capacity depleted by the sustained demand of the high-stress situation, only what is genuinely automatic, what has been practiced enough to run without much deliberate resource expenditure, remains reliably available. The person with well-trained emotional regulation practices in low-stakes situations carries those practices as established patterns that activate with less deliberate resource expenditure under high pressure. The person who has thought about emotional regulation but not practiced it discovers, under high pressure, that the thought about practices are unavailable because the deliberate resource needed to implement them has been consumed by the stress itself. This is the strongest possible argument for practicing emotional regulation in ordinary moments, that practice is the only path to availability under extraordinary ones. Maintaining clarity under stress is the central challenge of this chapter, and it addresses a specific feature of the high-stress state that distinguishes it from the acute conflict situations of the previous chapter. Acute conflict is intense but typically brief. The activation peaks, the exchange concludes, and the system has the opportunity to return toward baseline before the next significant demand arrives. High-stress situations, extended periods of genuine pressure, uncertainty, heavy responsibility, or sustained adverse conditions do not offer this structure. The demand is sustained. The activation is continuous, or nearly so. The opportunity for the full recovery that would restore regulatory capacity does not arrive between demands. Under these conditions, clarity is progressively more difficult to maintain, not because the situation gets harder, but because the regulatory resource available for clear thinking depletes across time. The decision made at hour 1 of a high-stress day is made with more cognitive capacity than the decision made at hour 10, even if the two decisions are equally important and the information available for each is equally complete. Managing clarity under sustained stress therefore requires both the regulatory practices that maintain as much capacity as possible during the high-demand period and the meta-awareness that recognizes when the capacity has depleted to the point where important decisions should be deferred rather than made from an impaired instrument. Stabilizing the nervous system quickly is a skill for the moments during sustained stress when the activation level has spiked above the manageable range and must be brought back down before effective functioning can continue. The spike may be produced by a specific event within the sustained stress and additional demand arriving at an already cover-coded moment. A piece of news that is itself activating within an already activated context. A conflict that ignites within a situation already characterized by high tension. The baseline was already elevated, the spike takes it above the functional threshold. Quick stabilization in these moments relies on the same physiological tools as the pause practice: deliberate slow breathing, particularly extended exhalation, physical grounding, attention deliberately brought to physical sensation in the body, to what is visible in the immediate environment, to the specific qualities of the present moment as opposed to the threatening projections about the near future, and the brief invocation of a perspective that is larger than the immediate moment, the temporal expansion practice of noting that this moment, as intense as it is one moment in a longer arc. None of these practices resolve the source of the stress. They reduce the activation level enough to restore functional access to deliberate thinking. That restoration is what allows the source of the stress to be addressed with something better than panicked reaction. Thinking clearly during emotional storms is not a capacity that must be continuously sustained across an entire high-stress period. It is a capacity that must be restored repeatedly, brought back online after each spike, maintained during the intervals between spikes, and protected through deliberate management of the overall load so that it is available when it is most needed. This framing of clarity as something to restore rather than maintain continuously is more honest and more practical than the idealized image of the perfectly composed person who never wavers under any conditions. Real human emotional systems do waver. Real sustained stress does deplete. The goal is not an impossible standard of unbroken composure, but the realistic standard of consistent return, the ability to come back to clarity from the moments of losing it. Emotional power in high-stress moments is, ultimately, the power of having prepared, not the power of an unusually strong or resilient system that is immune to depletion. The power of a system that has been practiced enough that the essential practices activate at lower resource cost. That recovers from spikes more quickly because the recovery practices are established, and that recognizes the warning signs of approaching the functional threshold early enough to take protective action before the threshold is crossed. This preparation does not happen in the high-stress moment. It happens in the ordinary moments that preceded it, the daily practices of awareness, of pause, of regulation, of deliberate recovery. The power in the storm is the product of everything done in the calm before it. Train the ordinary days. They are preparing you for the exceptional ones. Part V. Living with Emotional Mastery. Parts 1 through 4 have built, layer by layer, the understanding and the specific skills of emotional mastery. Part 5 addresses the larger question: what does a life characterized by emotional mastery actually look like? Not a life of perfect regulation. Not a life without difficult emotions or challenging moments. Not the life of someone who has solved the problem of being human. A life organized around the consistent practice of the skills described in the preceding chapters. Practiced imperfectly but persistently, producing an accumulated quality of presence and effectiveness that is qualitatively different from the life organized around reactivity. Chapter 10 is not a conclusion. It is a description of the ongoing practice that this audiobook has been preparing you to begin. Chapter 10. Becoming the calm center in chaos. Mastery is not perfection. It is consistency. This reframe is among the most important in this entire audiobook. Because the pursuit of emotional perfection, the standard in which every response is perfectly calibrated, every activation is immediately regulated, every difficult moment is navigated without visible disruption, is both impossible and demoralizing as a goal. It produces, in people serious about emotional development, a specific kind of failure mode, the application of the highest judgment to every moment of incomplete regulation, creating secondary emotional activation about the inadequacy of emotional management, which further depletes the regulatory resource and makes the next moment harder. The standard of mastery is not perfection, it is return. The person who has developed emotional mastery does not go through their days without activation, without reactive moments, without the occasional response that wisdom would not have produced. They are human. What distinguishes them is what happens after the activation, the speed and reliability of return to the regulated state, the quality of attention brought to understanding what happened and why, and the consistent re-engagement with the practices that maintain the regulatory capacity that the reactive moment temporarily compromised. Consistency across this standard means practicing the skills on ordinary days. It means returning to the regulated state after the reactive moments rather than staying in the self-ritual secondary activation. It means maintaining the awareness practice when nothing dramatic is happening so that the awareness is available when something dramatic does. Emotional leadership energy is what the consistent practice of emotional mastery produces over time, and it operates through the mechanism described at the close of Chapter 7. The calm person's regulated state influences the emotional environment around them through the same contagion pathways through which panic and distress spread. The person who is consistently regulated in their professional environment gradually becomes a stabilizing presence in that environment, not through authority or assertion, but through the accumulated effect of their consistently regulated responses on the people who regularly interact with them. Meetings they attend tend to be more productive because the reactive escalations that derail discussion are less likely to occur or to sustain themselves in their presence. Difficult conversations they participate in tend to resolve more fully because the emotional temperature remains accessible to deliberate engagement. People bring difficult problems to them because experience has established that the problems will be received with clarity rather than with reactivity. This influence is not claimed, it is demonstrated, slowly through consistent behavior that others observe and respond to. It is the indirect expression of emotional mastery in social and professional environments, not the announcement that you have developed this capacity, but the evidence of it that others read through your behavior across time. Long-term emotional stability is built through the consistent practice of the awareness and regulation skills across the full range of life's conditions, not just the acute high-stress moments that feel like the real test, but the ordinary relational friction, the minor disappointments, the small aggravations of daily life that seem too insignificant to apply practice to and that are, in fact, the primary terrain on which the capacity is either built or eroded. The small activations of ordinary life are where most emotional patterns are reinforced. The mild frustration that is expressed immediately rather than held. The low-grade anxiety that is managed through avoidance rather than examination. The minor grievance that is nursed rather than processed. These are not catastrophes. They are the quiet accumulation that either builds toward the threshold or is managed below it. Long-term stability is the result of managing below the threshold consistently, of maintaining the practices that prevent the accumulation from reaching the levels where overwhelm occurs. It is quieter than the acute crisis management that feels more dramatic. It is also more consequential because it is the difference between a life characterized by occasional emotional crises and a life in which the emotional system remains, on average, within the range where deliberate choice is possible. Returning to balance again and again is the most honest description of what long-term emotional mastery actually involves, and it is the framing that makes the project sustainable. Balance is not a permanent position, it is a direction. The emotionally masterful person is not someone who has arrived at perfect equilibrium and holds it indefinitely. They are someone who, when the natural variability of life and emotion pulls them away from the regulated center, knows the path back and takes it consistently, without drama, without the extended residence in the off-center position that the person without these skills tends to occupy. The path back is always the same path. The awareness practices that reveal what is happening. The pause that creates the space for deliberate response. The regulation strategies that work with the emotional energy rather than against it. The boundaries that maintain enough differentiation from the environment's emotional content to keep the internal ground usable. The breath, the naming, the observer position, the return. Becoming the calm center in chaos does not mean being unaffected by the chaos. It means being the person in the chaos whose internal state is stable enough to think clearly, to respond deliberately, to be useful rather than adding to the turbulence. It means being the person others notice is not unraveling, not because you are performing composure, but because you have built the actual internal architecture that produces it under conditions that would not support performance for long. This is what every chapter of this audiobook has been working toward. Not the ideal of the person who never struggles emotionally. The achievable reality of the person who, across the full ordinary range of life's difficulty, maintains enough regulatory capacity to keep their behavior aligned with their values and their interests rather than with the automatic demands of their activated states. That person is not a particular type. They are not born to this. They are not protected from difficulty. They are built one awareness practice at a time, one pause at a time, one moment of deliberate return at a time into someone who can be present to the full weight of emotional experience without being run by it. That person is the one this audiobook has been building toward. You. Returning to balance. Again and again. Closing. The skill that changes everything. You don't need to eliminate emotions. They are not the problem. They are information, real, important, often accurate information about what matters. What is at stake? What warrants attention? The anger that signals a violated value. The anxiety that signals a genuine risk. The sadness that signals the weight of something lost. The joy that signals alignment between where you are and where you want to be. These are not noises to be silenced. They are signals to be heard. What you do not need is to be controlled by them. The person controlled by their emotions does not feel more. They are not more authentic, more alive, more fully present to human experience. They are simply less able to choose. The feeling determines the behavior before the deliberate mind can participate. The emotion speaks and the body responds before wisdom has been consulted. The reaction happens, and then the person assesses what was done and whether they wanted to do it often after it is too late to matter. The person who has built emotional authority feels just as fully. The spectrum of human emotional experience is entirely intact. What is different is the relationship between what is felt and what is done. The feeling is present. The deliberate mind is also present. And in the space between them, the space that has been built through practice, widened through training, made reliable through consistent cultivation, genuine choice is possible. That space is authority. Consider what this audiobook has built across its 10 chapters. Part 1 established the foundations that emotions precede thinking and shape decisions more fundamentally than most people acknowledge, and that the distinction between reactivity and mastery is not about what is felt but about what happens between feeling and action. These foundations are not comfortable, but they are honest, and honest foundations are the only ones on which genuine building can occur. Part 2 built the operational understanding how emotional accumulation works and why overwhelm is not random but predictable, and how the skill of emotional awareness, early recognition, specific naming, non-judgmental engagement with what is happening internally is the precondition for everything that follows. You cannot regulate what you cannot notice. The noticing comes first. Part 3 developed the core skills, the pause that creates the space where authority lives. the regulation strategies that work with emotional energy rather than against it, and the emotional boundaries that protect the internal ground from unnecessary depletion through contagion. Each of these is learnable. Each requires practice, and each, once built, changes the quality of moment-to-moment experience in ways that compound across the months and years of consistent application. Part 4 applied the architecture to the real conditions that most test at conflict, where the other person's emotional activation directly engages yours and the social pressure toward reactive response is strongest, and high-stress situations, where sustained depletion creates specific challenges that brief acute moments do not. The skills that Part 3 built become advantages precisely in these conditions, not advantages of a different kind, but advantages that deepen under the pressure that would erode anything less than genuinely trained capacity. And Part 5 pointed toward the ongoing practice, the consistency that is the definition of mastery, the emotional leadership energy that radiates from regulated presence into the environments that presence inhabits, the long-term stability that is the cumulative product of returning to balance across thousands of ordinary moments, and the identity of the calm center, not a fixed state achieved once, but a consistent practice of finding the way back. This skill changes everything. Not as a promise, as a description of what consistently happens when the emotional system is brought under genuine rather than performed authority. The decisions change. The ones made from clarity rather than from activated state reflect what you actually value rather than what the feeling of the moment demanded. The relational quality changes. Interactions characterized by deliberate response rather than reactive escalation build trust, deepen understanding, and produce outcomes that both parties wanted rather than regretted. The internal experience changes. The proportion of time spent in the deliberate, observing, choosing mode versus the automatic, reactive mode shifts slowly, imperfectly but meaningfully in the direction of agency. And at the identity level, the deepest level that this audiobook has been addressing throughout, something fundamental shifts. The self-concept organized around the automatic expression of feeling gives way to a self-concept organized around something more stable, the person who has built, through consistent deliberate practice, the capacity to be with the full weight of emotional experience without being determined by it. You don't need to eliminate emotions. You only need to stop being controlled by them. And that skill changes everything.